UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is visiting South Africa, the first African nation to chair the G20 economic bloc. The Southern African nation assumed the one-year rotating presidency of the bloc on December 1st. G20 members include both developing and developed countries, who together make up about 85% of the global gross domestic product, more than 75% of international trade, and account for about two-thirds of the world's population. SABC News International Editor Sophie Mokoena is about to discuss a few issues there with the UN Chief, Antonio Guterres. Sophie, over to you.
Yes, Bongiwe, we are going to be in conversation with the UN Chief, Antonio Guterres, who's in the country, but he will also be traveling to Lesotho, the Mountain Kingdom. SG, welcome to South Africa. You visited South Africa last year during the BRICS Summit. You are here. South Africa is preparing for the most important gathering, the G20. What was your message to those that you interacted with, starting from in Johannesburg, the International Relations Minister, and you just spoke to President Ramaphosa?
A very strong message of solidarity. We are going to live an historic moment. For the first time in the history of the G20, that are the most powerful countries in the world, the G20 are presided by an African country, by South Africa. Now, Africa suffers a dramatic situation of injustice, and injustice that is deeply rooted in history. I come from Portugal. Portugal was the last colonial country in Africa. So I know exactly what it means, the colonial legacy. And I know how it represents a terrible handicap for Africa to be able to overcome its challenges. So we need to have a very strong commitment of the international community to correct these injustices and to create the conditions for the African continent to be able to provide to its citizens what its citizens deserve. And we count a lot on the presidency by South Africa of the G20 to start redressing some of these injustices. And I came to tell President Ramaphosa that he fully counts on me and fully counts on the UN. We are totally behind the South African presidency. We are totally supportive of the objectives of the South African presidency, and we want the South African president to be a landmark in a movement to start seriously redressing the dramatic injustices that Africa is suffering. Suffering in the economy, suffering in climate, suffering in conflict, and suffering because, as I said, those injustices are deeply rooted and very difficult to overcome. So a lot of active solidarity of the international community is absolutely necessary.
You spoke about the transformation of the financial system since the Second World War. Only the developed countries are benefiting. How can South Africa ensure that there's movement in relation to transformation of the financial system?
We just had the Summit of the Future. And it was clear in the Summit of the Future that the institutions that we have, that were created after the Second World War, still largely represent the world of that time. There were practically no independent African countries. I mean, Ethiopia, Egypt, I mean, very few. Africa was not present when they were created. And the same with other parts of the world. And so the truth is that the system was created essentially by a group of rich countries of the North to address their problems. And we had the reconstruction of Europe that was possible after the Second World War, so that was useful. The problem is that now is outdated, because now we have a world that goes beyond that 1945 world, that covers the entire planet, and where we have a large number of countries, developing countries, that are drowning in debt, that are in an extremely difficult financial situation, that are the victims of climate change without contributing to climate change, with devastation, with destruction in their countries, and without resources to protect their populations. And so this system that was supposed to be a global safety net today is not a global safety net for everybody in the world. And so we need to reform the system. And to reform the system means, to a large extent, to give developing countries voice and representation in the governance bodies of the international financial institutions. Like we need to give voice and presence, namely to African countries, in the permanent members of the Security Council. Security Council that we have today still has 3 European countries in the 5 permanent members. I mean, Europe doesn't represent 3/5 of the world. It is clear. No African country, no Latin American country. This needs to be corrected. And we need a Security Council that is more legitimate and more effective. And we all recognize that the present Security Council is completely outdated and completely dysfunctional. And the same applies to a large extent to international financial institutions. So we need reform, and we need reform in the name of justice. We need reform to correct the inequalities and injustices that are embedded in the system as the system exists today.
One injustice is the impact of climate change. You were at the Climate Change Summit, COP29, in Azerbaijan. It looks like there was no progress.
It is not entirely true. I was not happy with the result. I was hoping for much more ambition, both in relation to the financial questions and in relation to the mitigation, the perspective of reduction of emissions, of phasing out of fossil fuels. So, as I said, the result was meager in relation to what I would like, but it was very important to come to an agreement. And that agreement, if it had not happened, we would now be paralyzed. Countries that now need to present their national action plans, their so-called national determined contributions, without an agreement on the finance, very probably most of those plans would not be adequate in relation to the needs that we have in the world. And second, Brazil, that is a country we fully trust in their commitment to climate action. Brazil, that has ambitious plans for the next COP, would see its COP entirely consumed by the problems inherited from Baku. So, as I said, it is not the solution I would like, but at least it was possible to avoid a situation of paralysis that would be a total disaster.
Let's talk about the UN again in relation to maintenance of peace. When it was formed after the Second World War, the intention was to ensure that there's no war in the world, much as we don't have a world war, but we have lots of challenges. The Middle East, Syria, people are saying this might lead to a very bad situation in relation to governance in the Middle East. What's your view on the current situation in Syria?
I want to see Syria with a symbol of hope. There was a terrible dictatorship, and that dictatorship has ended. Now, obviously, there are many armed groups, but we had some positive signals. The former prime minister that was there from the old regime transmitted power to a new interim prime minister. There is a sense of optimism in the population, and there are commitments of these groups, some of them with a reputation of radicalism, but there are commitments that they want an inclusive process and that they want all minorities to have their rights respected. So I hope that Syria will be able to have this kind of transition. I hope that this will pave the way also for Syria That is a crossroad of civilizations. It's a pity to see this country divided into bits and pieces. I hope that this will pave the way for the unity, the sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Syria.
But we see
of course,
Israel already approaching.
Having said so, it is also true that there are many risks. It's also true that there are many actors around with their interests, and so this will not be an easy job. But we badly need at the present moment to grab the signs of hope that exist.
Palestine, no solution.
Now, Palestine is an immense tragedy. I feel completely heartbroken with what's happening to the Palestinian people. The level of destruction in Gaza, the number of people killed, maimed in Gaza are unprecedented in my times as Secretary General of the United Nations. And worst, I mean, there is a risk of hope to be lost. It's absolutely essential to have a political solution, starting by a ceasefire and the release of all hostages, that apparently there is now some chance that it might happen, but then a political solution leading to two states, a Palestinian state, an Israeli state, living side by side in peace and security. And unfortunately, the actions that Israel has been conducting recently are making it more and more difficult to get this result, which is a tragedy, because without a two-state solution, there will never be peace in the Middle East. And we need peace in the Middle East, and we need Israelis and Palestinians to be able to live in peace.
Let's talk about Africa. The G20 presidency, yes, it's South Africa. Other people are saying South Africa punching above its weight as the only African country. Fortunately, now you have the AU as part of the G20. The war in Sudan, the conflict in the Middle East. You also have a problem here on our doorstep, that's Mozambique, Cabo Delgado. How can the African continent ensure that it is able to address these challenges? Because where there are conflicts, you are not going to have development.
But let's be clear, this is not only an African problem. You have the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, Syria, you have Lebanon, you have Myanmar, we have other crises in other parts of the world. And what is dramatic is that there is a sense of impunity. What is dramatic is because, I mean, the multilateral system has no teeth to impose solutions. I mean, the UN has some peacekeeping missions, but peacekeeping is peacekeeping. When you have terrorist organizations, when you have a war, the peacekeepers, there is no peace to keep. So their capacity to deliver is very limited. They can do some protection of civilians, but their capacity to guarantee peace is non-existent. And the truth is that the Security Council is paralyzed, and it is not able to take decisions that are forceful decisions with imposition to the countries. On the other hand, as the big powers are so divided, nobody is afraid of them anymore. And as nobody is afraid of them anymore, there is a sense of impunity. Everybody can do whatever they want. Look at what's happening in Sudan. They are just fighting each other and nothing happens to them. And then you have other countries supporting them and giving them weapons. And then there is this mixture of internal problems with external problems and with interference from the outside, and not only from Africa, I mean, also from other parts of the world inside Africa. So this is a very difficult moment in which we see this lack of accountability. And there is one signal of hope. It was after years of fighting, it was possible to obtain from the Security Council the approval of the possibility of peace enforcing and counter-terrorism operations led by the African Union, but financed at 75% by the UN. And this is the solution that I hope will be able to address some of the African crises. Because there it's not peacekeeping, it's not just blue helmets that go around and try to appease situations, but it is an African force with the capacity to impose peace and with the capacity to punish those that are violating that peace. So there is this signal of hope. We are creating an instrument. Let's hope that instrument works. We are discussing it now about Somalia, as you know. And I am truly convinced that the only way to address some of these conflicts is by a peace-enforcing operation in which an African force supported by the international community is able to impose peace and to make sure that the spoilers are punished.
And finally, SG, how do we ensure that the leaders do get the message? We've been talking about these things, and it looks like they are not listening. It's getting worse.
You know, there is a lot of deafness in the world. I agree with you. And lots of people tend to only listen to what they like and not listen to what they do not like. And there is indeed in today's world a lack of leadership. Because the geopolitical divides, because of the many problems that exist at different levels in many countries, there is a lack of vision, a lack of leadership, a lack of the capacity of leaders to mobilize their peoples and to come together in order to be able to address the enormous challenges we face. Climate, the problems of conflict, and the dramatic inequalities that generate poverty and hunger in so many parts of the world.
Thank you so much for your time, SG. I know that you arrived today and tomorrow you have to go to the Mountain Kingdom. Thank you so much for your time.
It was a pleasure.
That was the UN Chief, Antonio Guterres. Tomorrow he will be traveling to the Mountain Kingdom, Lesotho. And I guess our colleague Rapelang will be on standby to follow the SG in the Mountain Kingdom. Back to you in studio.